In the autumn of 1978, a young man checked into a roadside motel on the edge of Calford, Massachusetts, paid for 3 nights in cash, and was never seen alive again. No family called the police. No headline carried his name, because for more than 40 years, no one even knew what his name was. He was a stranger in a town full of strangers passing through, and when he was found, the case was written up in a few thin pages, filed under a number, and quietly forgotten by almost everyone who touched it. He had no one to demand answers for him. He became, in every way that a person can, lost. But more than 4 decades later, a single fingerprint, lifted from his motel room in 1978, and left to sit in a cardboard box for the rest of the century, would finally give him back his name and put a face to the man who took his life. This is the story of the case nobody remembered, and the people who refused, in the end, to let it stay that way. But before we get to the box in the basement, you have to understand the young man in room 11 and the world that swallowed him. Calford, Massachusetts, in 1978, was a city coming apart at the seams. The mills along the river had been closing for 20 years, and what was left of the work was leaving too. The downtown storefronts were half empty. Out on Route 12, where the highway came through, there was a strip of motor lodges and diners and gas stations that lived off the people just passing through. Truckers and salesmen and drifters, and anyone whose life had come unmoored enough to land them on a state highway with nowhere particular to be. It was the tail end of a hard decade. Gas had gotten expensive and scarce. Disco came tinny out of car radios, and the whole region had the gray, worn-down look of a place the country was leaving behind. The Skyview Motor Lodge sat at the far end of that strip, a low L-shaped building of a dozen rooms behind a tall neon sign that buzzed the word vacancy in pink against the night. Because there was almost always a vacancy. It smelled of cigarette smoke and damp carpet and the cold air coming off the highway. People did not stay at the Skyview because they wanted to. They stayed because it was cheap and it asked no questions. The young man who checked into room 11 on a rainy Tuesday in October was, the clerk would later say, polite and quiet, in his early 20s with a guitar case and not much else. He signed the register in a hurried hand and paid cash. For decades, that signature and that guitar case were nearly all anyone knew of him. Only much later, when the case was finally given the attention it had always deserved, would the rest come back, pieced together from records 1,000 miles away, that his name was Stephen Cobb, that everyone who loved him had called him Stevie, that he was 23 years old and had grown up in a small town in Ohio. He had left home a few years before after a falling out with his father, and he had been drifting east ever since, picking up work where he could, washing dishes, loading trucks, playing rhythm guitar in bar bands for gas money and a place to sleep. He wrote postcards home less and less often. His people assumed, the way families sometimes do, that he was just a young man who needed to roam, and that he would turn up again when he was ready. He had a way about him that the few people who crossed his path that week remembered for a long time. He held a door for the maid. He played his guitar low in the evenings, just for himself, and a man in the next room said the music was the only good thing about the place. He told the diner waitress he was headed for the coast to find a band that needed a player, and he left her the kind of tip a man leaves when he doesn't have much, but remembers what it's like to need it. He was 23, and he was on his way somewhere, and the night he stopped at the Skyview was supposed to be nothing more than a place to sleep between one part of his life and the next. It is worth stopping on that, because it is the whole tragedy in miniature. Stephen Cobb was not at the end of anything. He was in the middle of it. He was the kind of young man who exists in the gap between the family he'd left and the life he hadn't quite built yet, the kind the world has a hard time keeping track of, precisely because he was still in motion. People in that gap are easy to lose. When one of them disappears, there is often no fixed address to check, no employer to notice, no one whose Sunday is broken by a phone that doesn't ring. That is what made Stevie vulnerable in life, and it is exactly what made him disposable in death. What happened in room 11 happened sometime in the dark hours, and for a very long time, no one bothered to find out much more than that. A maid named Rosa found him on the third morning, when he did not answer her knock and his 3 nights were up. She let herself in to clean and instead ran across the lot screaming for the manager. The details of what she saw were never made public, and they will not be repeated here. What is known is that the young man had been killed in the course of what looked like a robbery. His wallet was gone. The cash he had shown at check-in was gone. And the second-hand car he had driven up in, the car the waitress remembered him mentioning, was gone from the lot. The Calford police came. A detective named Walter Healy caught the case. And here, at the very beginning, is where the young man in room 11 began to disappear a second time. He carried no identification that anyone could find. The name on the register, when police tried to trace it, led nowhere they could follow with the tools of 1978. There was no one local who knew him. No mother called. No employer reported him gone. To the overworked detectives of a broke, declining city, he was the worst kind of case to land on a desk. A robbery murder of an unknown drifter, with no family, no witnesses, and no leads. There was, however, one piece of physical evidence done right. A patrolman with good instincts dusted the room and the guitar case and lifted several clean, latent fingerprints that did not belong to the victim. They were photographed, recorded on cards, and set aside. Because in 1978, there was no fast way to search a fingerprint against the millions on file. You could compare a print to a suspect. You could not yet ask a computer to find the suspect for you. And there was no suspect. Detective Healy did what he could, which was not much, and what he did is a quiet indictment of how the world decides whose death matters. He questioned the people around the motel. He questioned the night clerk and handyman, a wiry, unremarkable man named Lyle Brock, who lived in a room at the back and kept the place running, and who said he'd seen and heard nothing. He ran the plate of the missing car and put out a notice on it. He waited for someone to report a missing young man who might match. No one ever did. Compare it, for a moment, to how a case like this would have gone if the victim had been a local girl from a family that knew the mayor. There would have been search parties. There would have been press conferences and reward money and a name in the paper every single day until someone was caught. Stephen Cobb got none of that. Not because anyone was cruel, but because the machinery of attention simply never turned on for him. He was poor. He was passing through, and he was, as far as anyone could tell, alone in the world. In a busy department in a broke city, that arithmetic was fatal. Within a few weeks, with no name, no family, and no one applying any pressure, the file stopped growing. The young man was buried in the paupers section of the Calford Town Cemetery under a flat marker that read only the year and a case number. The fingerprints went into a box. The box went onto a shelf. And the city, which had troubles enough of its own, forgot him completely. For more than 40 years, that is where the matter rested. The Skyview Motor Lodge limped along into the 1980s and then the 1990s, its neon sign losing letters one by one until it only said Cancy. And then, nothing at all. The strip on Route 12 emptied out as the interstate pulled the traffic away. Detective Walter Healy worked other cases, retired, and died, and more than one person who knew him said the drifter at the Skyview was the file that bothered him most, precisely because he had not been able to give it the time it deserved. The maid, Rosa, the one who had found him, never forgot the young man with the guitar. She kept a small private grief for a stranger nobody else mourned, and once a year, for decades, she put a few flowers on the numbered marker in the paupers section, because it seemed to her unbearable that no one else would. 1,000 miles away in Ohio, Stevie Cobb's family lived inside a slower, sadder version of forgetting. His mother wrote letters that came back unopened from old addresses. The postcards had stopped, and then the hope had thinned, and somewhere over the years the family quietly settled into the belief that Stevie had simply chosen a life that did not include them. His mother went to her grave, still leaving the porch light on out of habit. His younger sister, Annie, grew up and grew older, never knowing whether her brother was alive somewhere, angry with them, or gone. The not knowing has its own particular weight, and the Cobbs carried it for 40 years, without even knowing there was a grave to visit. Every case like this one represents weeks of digging through forgotten files, chasing records across state lines, and giving a name back to someone the world set aside. If you want this channel to keep finding the people that history overlooked, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what keeps the forgotten from staying forgotten. Now, let's go back to Calford. The case broke open, as forgotten things sometimes do, by accident, and because of a wrecking ball. In 2021, the long-dead Skyview Motor Lodge was finally condemned and slated for demolition, and the county undertook a long-overdue project to digitize decades of old police and property records before the buildings tied to them came down. The job of sorting the oldest evidence boxes fell to a young cold case detective named Marie Sable, who had a habit of actually reading the files she was supposed to be filing. Late one evening, she opened a water-stained box marked only with a year and a number, and inside she found the thin file on an unidentified young man killed at the Skyview, and a yellowed envelope of fingerprint cards that, as far as she could tell, had never once been searched against a modern database. They couldn't have been. The databases hadn't existed. What stopped her, she said later, was not the murder. It was the silence around it. There were almost no follow-up reports, no clippings, no letters from a family. A person had been killed and then, it seemed, simply sat down and walked away from. And the longer she sat with the thin little file, the more it bothered her. She decided the young man with no name was going to get, 43 years late, the one thing he had never been given: somebody's full attention. So she did the simple thing that 40 years of technology had made possible, and that no one had ever gotten around to doing. She had the latent prints from room 11 scanned and run through the automated fingerprint identification system, the vast computerized index that can compare a single print against tens of millions in a matter of hours, something Detective Healy could only have dreamed of. The way it works is almost unfair in its simplicity. A print that was a dead end in 1978, useless without a suspect to match it to, becomes in the modern system a question the computer can answer on its own, searching every set of prints ever entered until it finds the hand that left it. It took 2 days. The prints from the guitar case came back to a man named Lyle Brock. 2 threads unspooled from that single hit, and they ran in opposite directions. The first led to the victim, working with the old register and a national effort to identify the nameless dead. Investigators and a forensic genealogist were finally able to put a name to the young man in the pauper's grave. The drifter at the Skyview was Stephen Cobb of Ohio, and he had a sister, Annie, still living, who had spent 40 years not knowing. When Detective Sable reached her by phone, Annie Cobb sat down on her kitchen floor and wept for a brother she had half convinced herself had simply stopped loving them. He had not stopped. He had been 4 days into a trip to the coast, and he had never gotten to make a single phone call again. The second thread led to the man who took him. To understand how Lyle Brock had stayed invisible for 43 years, you have to understand that he had never gone anywhere at all. He was not a phantom who blew through town and vanished. He was the night clerk, the handyman, the man who lived in the back room and fixed the leaking faucets, the one person who was always there. Detective Healy had questioned him in 1978 and crossed him off, because there was no reason on earth to look hard at a quiet motel handyman in the death of a guest nobody could name. Brock had simply kept on. He worked odd jobs around Calford for the next 4 decades. Never married, never drew attention. Was arrested exactly once in the 1980s for a minor theft, which is how his fingerprints came to be in the system at all. He grew old 2 miles from the numbered grave of the young man he had killed. He had been hiding in plain sight, in the most literal way, by never once leaving the place where it happened. The evidence, once Sable knew where to point it, came together quickly. The print on the guitar case, the stolen car, which old records showed had turned up abandoned and stripped on the far side of the county weeks after the murder, in an area Brock was known to frequent. And Rosa, the maid, now elderly but sharp, who told Sable something she had told a detective once in 1978 and been thanked and ignored for, that Brock had been short with money the week before and flush with it the week after, and that she had always wondered. When detectives sat across from Lyle Brock, 74 years old now, and laid the fingerprint and the rest of it on the table, court records show he did not put up much of a fight. He had carried it a long time, in his own way. He confessed to a robbery that he said was never meant to be anything more. He had known the young man was traveling with cash and a car. He had let himself into room 11 in the dark with a passkey. And when Stevie Cobb woke up, it had gone the way those things go. He had about $40 and a guitar, Brock said, in the flattest account imaginable of a human life. I wanted the car. $40 and a used car. That was the sum total of what Stephen Cobb's life had been traded for, by a man who then went back to fixing faucets and slept down the hall for 40 years. The news barely made a ripple in a Calford that had never known the story to begin with. But for the few who remembered, it landed hard. Rosa, who had put flowers on a numbered grave for decades, finally had a name to write. The retired officers who had come up under Walter Healy heard that the file that haunted their old detective had finally closed, and more than one of them said they wished he'd lived to know it. And Lyle Brock, at 74, was convicted of murder and sent to prison, where the math of his age means he will almost certainly die. After 43 years, the case that everyone forgot was marked, at last solved. Stephen Cobb was 23 years old. He played rhythm guitar in bar bands for gas money and held doors for strangers, and was on his way to the coast to find people who needed a player. He had a mother and a sister who loved him, and a laugh, his sister says, that you could hear across a room. He was not a drifter. Not really. Not in the way the word was used to wave him off in 1978. He was a young man in the restless middle of becoming someone, and that restlessness was mistaken, by everyone whose job it was to care, for not mattering. The cruelty at the center of this story is not only that he was killed for the price of a used car, it is that for 40 years, the world agreed he wasn't worth the trouble of remembering. His family brought him home. The numbered marker in the paupers section came up, and Stephen Cobb was reburied in Ohio, beside his mother, under a stone that finally carries his name and the only word his sister wanted on it, which was beloved. His guitar, recovered from the old evidence box, sits now in Annie's living room. Detective Healy did not live to see it, but the instinct of one patrolman who dusted a room carefully in 1978 reached across 4 decades to finish what Healy couldn't. And cases like Stephen's have since pushed departments across the country to do the unglamorous work of running old prints and naming old John Does, because somewhere in every one of those forgotten boxes is a person who belonged to someone. The years have a way of burying things, and they bury the poor and the nameless and the passing through deepest of all, because no one is left standing over the grave to keep the dirt off. But a name is a stubborn thing. It waited in a register, and in the memory of a maid, and in the records of a town 1,000 miles away, until someone was finally willing to look. And once Stephen Cobb had his name back, he could never be forgotten again. I'd like to know what you think. Lyle Brock lived for 43 years 2 miles from the grave of the man he killed, never running, never hiding, simply trusting that no one would care enough to look. What does it say that he was right for so long? What troubles you more, the murder for the price of a car, or the 4 decades the world spent agreeing that a young man with a guitar wasn't worth investigating? And how many others are lying in numbered graves tonight, waiting for a name, simply because they happened to die far from anyone who would fight for them? The case everyone forgot was finally solved after 43 years, and a young man named Stephen Cobb was given back his name, his story, and his family. Stories like his are why this channel exists, and why we believe that no one should stay forgotten and no death should go unanswered, however long it takes. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.